Alright guys, welcome back. We're going to get started on chapter 2, which is all about the Constitution. Now, we're not going to go into all of the specifics because your introduction assignment is going to cover that. But we'll talk about general principles, key pieces of the Constitution, and kind of the time frame leading up to the adoption of the U.S. Constitution, as well as the time frame that followed. So we'll look at the debates about liberty that came out of the Revolutionary War and eventually led into the Constitutional Convention. As I mentioned, we'll discuss the major proposals, key ideas, and we'll also talk about the different compromises that were made at the Constitutional Convention. Additionally, we'll summarize the key issues that were presented by Federalists and Anti-Federalists in the debate over ratification, that is, approval of the new U.S. Constitution. And then, really briefly at the end, we'll talk about the continuing debates about the Constitution and our democracy. All right, so this first slide, this is kind of a lead up to the Revolutionary War. These were some of the policies that the British had enacted leading up to the Revolutionary War that really added fuel to the fire for the colonists. Up until 1761, the colonists are fairly happy living under British rule. However, the British over time become more restrictive, put more taxes on them, so on and so forth, and so that really leads to the Revolutionary War. You have the Writs of Assistance, which allowed British officials to search homes for smuggled goods. The Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, all of these things put taxes on all of the everyday items that colonists are using. The Tea Act created really a monopoly for the British East India Company on tea. It would have actually made tea cheaper for the colonists as part of the agreement, but the major disagreement over this act is that they were forcing the colonists to buy their tea only from the British East India Company. And again, this is an act in a long line of other policies that the colonists are not okay with, right? Because the biggest issue at hand here is that they weren't represented in the decision that was made that is having an impact on them. Now we know the Tea Act is followed by the Boston Tea Party when the Sons of Liberty and other colonists throw tea into Boston Harbor. The British are not happy about it, and so they pass another series of acts referred to by colonists as the Intolerable Acts. The British actually called them the Coercive Acts because they thought they were going to be the policies that were really going to force the colonists into compliance. It really has the opposite effect, though. The Intolerable Acts included policies that restricted town meetings, right? They didn't want colonists gathering because then they could be making plans in their opposition, right? They allowed for British soldiers to be housed in private homes like spies, right? And so this really becomes the breaking point for the colonists, and they're not okay with this government overreach anymore. So then we have a call for liberty, right? A call for freedom. In your notes packet, I have a piece on what is the meaning of liberty. I would like you to think a little bit about what that term means to you, because it's still a term that is thrown around all the time when talking about democratic ideals, what the United States should look like, so on and so forth. So think about what that term looks like for you, and then if you would follow up by looking that up in your textbook, or some other reputable source, and kind of compare what you thought and what it actually means. Now, some thoughts that the colonists had about government and really life and society in general. There's this inherent belief that people are selfish, right? We are selfish by nature. Nothing we can do a ton about, really, right? So they said because of this, men will seek power because they are ambitious and greedy and they're easily corruptible, right? The colonists were seeking natural rights, which had been talked about during the Enlightenment period as life, liberty, and property. We would put that in our declaration as the pursuit of happiness. And so natural rights, the colonists really thought, like these Enlightenment thinkers, that there were certain rights that we were just born with, that were God-given, and that those rights could not be taken away by anyone or any government. And so they're looking for a government that guarantees those rights, right? To life, liberty, property, the pursuit of happiness, so on and so forth. So we have like this revolutionary state of mind that starts to form in the 1770s. This is a mock-up of Patrick Henry delivering his speech on the rights of the colonies, really urging Virginia to get on board to fight the revolution. So, in class, we're going to look at the Declaration of Independence. Declaration of Independence is really broken up into 4 main pieces. You have the preamble, which is more or less an introduction, right? This is our intent. This is what this note is going to say, or this declaration. And then you have their theory on government. So this is where they talk about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, about how the relationship between government and man is a social contract, where the man gives government power, right? So on and so forth. And then the bulk of the declaration is really listing where the king has gone wrong. They follow up with their Declaration of Freedom. The British saw it as a declaration of war. So this is finally signed and sent over to the king, and really is the official start of the Revolutionary War. Now, we're going to kind of skate over the Revolutionary War because I am not a war historian. That stuff you probably learned in US history in like 8th grade, right? And you can Google it. There is a crash course video also. But we're going to kind of skate over that. The Revolutionary War comes to an end by like 1781, right? And now we won, surprisingly, right? And we need to figure out what type of government we're going to put into place, right? Because we've been preaching about what we think government should look like, but how are we actually going to put it into place? So thinking back to the colonists' experience with the king, we have a monarchy where one person has most government control. Now, the British had a legislature or parliament of sorts, but the colonists weren't represented in there, and ultimately a lot of the decisions could be made by the king. So we want to get as far away from that as possible, right? That leads us to the Articles of Confederation in 1781. The Articles of Confederation were not really seen as a new government for the colonists. They were seen more so as a league of friendship between the states. There is no strong central government at all. If I were to compare the Articles of Confederation to a similar entity today, I would think of kind of a global organization like the United Nations, right? Where you have participating member countries, but there's not a ton of true power that can be enforced, right? Like, they'll do their best. You obviously don't want the whole world against you. But some of these things can be hard to enforce just because of the nature of the organization. Articles of Confederation was similar. We had member states with really no national government. We had a Congress, right? No national court system, no executive, no power to actually enforce laws or treaties, no power to collect taxes, which meant that the small central government that we did have couldn't do anything anyway because they didn't have any money, okay? In 1785, John Hancock was elected to the office of president under the Articles of Confederation, which is basically the head of the Confederation Congress. He never showed up to take the job because he said it was meaningless, right? So the articles, it's pretty obvious after they're put into effect that there's a lot of weaknesses that need to be figured out. Now, we try and work with them for a while, okay? In the meantime, states form their own constitutions. And states really hold most of the power. Many of the state constitutions at this time have their own Bill of Rights. What really leads to the downfall of the articles, though, is the economic turmoil that they caused. Okay, because there was no power to tax, because there was 13 different currencies, we had states that were really well off, right? Well populated, their money was worth something, and you had states who had few people and found it hard to get by. And so these economic disparities ultimately lead to events like Shays' Rebellion, which happens in 1787, where we have this violent uprising in Massachusetts. There was a debt crisis in Massachusetts. Really, there was a debt crisis everywhere following the Revolutionary War because it was a very expensive war for the young colonies. And this uprising was just like a bunch of farmers who couldn't pay their rent, right? And this uprising, this violent uprising, really exposes on a national level the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation, and eventually it leads to the Constitutional Convention. Now, the Constitutional Convention originally is just supposed to be a convention where we're going to propose changes to the Articles of Confederation. However, in order to change the articles, you needed 13 of 13 states on board with any amendments or changes. We can hardly get 50% in Congress today, right? That's an uphill battle to get a law passed and to get 1 over 50%. So to get 13 out of 13 to literally change the founding document for this first type of government, it proves to be impossible, right? There's fear of anarchy in the colonies. So we have this call for a constitutional convention. 55 delegates show up. Okay, delegates are just representatives. Rhode Island doesn't send anyone. They don't want to be any part of this. Okay. Now, the people at the Constitutional Convention are mostly young, very educated for their time. Many of them had some college education, which really was unheard of for the time. And they come here and they try and amend the articles and nothing works. So instead, they produce a brand new constitution. So if the British monarchy was here and the Articles of Confederation were here, really we wanted to build a government that was somewhere in the middle in terms of division of power between the central government and the states. Our framers show a strong commitment to liberty and natural rights in their writing of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights that's eventually going to follow. So, two major proposals are brought to the table. We have the Virginia Plan. Virginia is obviously a big state, geographically, population-wise at the time as well. So they have their own interests. And then you have the New Jersey Plan, which really was representative of small states. So in your book, there's a whole section on the Virginia and New Jersey Plan. I want you to look through that and sort these different terms, more or less, into which plan they belonged to. There's going to be a few things on this list that belong in the middle. They were included on both plans and agreed upon by pretty much everyone at the convention. Now, the compromise between these two plans is known as the Great Compromise, or the Connecticut Compromise. Now, some of the compromises that happened. They decided for the legislature, we would have a House of Representatives that was popularly elected. So you and I would vote for House members. That popularly elected House would be based on a state's population, just like it is today, right? In North Dakota, we have one House member, where a state like New York has close to 30, right? Then, at the time the Constitution is written, they agree upon a state-elected Senate, where the state legislatures chose 2 people per state to represent them in the Senate. They also agree upon the Electoral College as a method for electing the president. In this new Constitution, they create a republic, right, which we said is another term for representative democracy. So people would vote for people to represent them in Congress, in the White House, so on and so forth. Now, I want you to think about why the framers might have preferred a republic. Thinking back to some of the stuff we talked about with Chapter 1, what are your thoughts on that? Why did they see the republic as the better option for these new United States? All right, then we have Marbury versus Madison. And Marbury versus Madison establishes a principle of judicial review. Now, I'm not going to go over all of the details with this because I have a write-up on Marbury versus Madison for you that I'm going to have you look at, but I want you to think about some of the key details involved in the case. John Marshall was a strong Federalist, meaning he believed in a strong central government. So as Chief Justice, I want you to think about what his decision may be in the case after you take a look at the key details. And then we'll discuss what he chose in the future. All right, so we're going over just key principles right now that are found in our new Constitution. Judicial review, which was the outcome of Marbury versus Madison, is not technically included in the Constitution word for word, but it was written about in the Federalist Papers, which were the papers that were written by James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay, fighting for ratification or approval of the new Constitution. So John Marshall didn't just dream that idea up. Some other key principles that were included, though, in the written body of the Constitution. We had separation of powers. Okay, so we divided out the power of the central government amongst three branches: the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. We had certain powers that were given explicitly to the federal government. We call that enumerated powers. Those are found in Articles 1, 2, and 3 of the U.S. Constitution. Additionally, in Article 1, we laid out some powers that would be reserved for the states. This was going to be a new federal system where states and the central government shared power. So it was important that this new Constitution wrote out what are some of these things that only the states can do, right? And then we have concurrent powers, which concurrent is just a fancy word for shared. So there are certain powers that both the state and the federal government hold. For example, the power of taxation, right? You pay your federal income tax, but to the states you pay sales tax and property tax. In North Dakota, we have a small income tax as well. Now, there's a few different power structures that they could have gone with. Okay, we end up going with a federal system. I'll show you what that looks like in a bit. But the power structure in the 13 colonies prior to the Revolutionary War was a unitary system. So all of the power in the government was held by one strong central power. And then, like, there were little satellite offices, basically. If you think about the United States today, this would mean that we don't have any state governments, right? We don't have a North Dakota Department of Health. We don't have a North Dakota governor. What we maybe have would be a satellite office of the federal government, just for convenience sake, right? Of the central government, I should say. So, strong central power in a unitary system. Now we go completely opposite in the Articles of Confederation and design what's called a confederal system, or confederation, where the individual states, in this case are blue boxes, hold all of the power, and they give up some little powers to a central government, really not much, right? In the case of the Articles of Confederation, it's basically like, we'll declare war together, right? Very minor amounts of power. Now, our Constitution designs a federal system where this written document, in our case the Constitution, gives power to both the central government and the states. Equal power. Unlike a unitary or confederal system, the two levels of government share power. Now, the founders were concerned about human nature and how quickly human nature could maybe derail this new constitutional government, right? But they also recognized that more government was necessary because we need some rules, right? Because we're selfish, we do things for ourselves, right? We need some rules. So they know that in this system, they have to set up safeguards against human nature, against corruption and selfishness. So the main thing they do in the Constitution is they call for checks and balances. Basically, the executive can't do anything without Congress or the judiciary following up on it. And Congress can't do anything without approval of the executive, right? So they all need to work together. They're all sort of intertwined. You should have looked at some checks and balances on your introduction assignment. The other thing that the founders said would really aid in controlling human nature was our tendency to factionalize. And James Madison is going to talk about this in Federalist 10, which we will read together in class. But factions are just groups of people with common interests, right? And they recognize that in a nation the size of the United States, there's going to be so many different groups with different ideas. And so these factions or these groups of people would keep each other in check. And they would keep the government in check, right? And so we would kind of self-check ourselves. Now, out of the Constitutional Convention comes a fight for ratification, okay? We need approval of like 2/3 of the states, roughly, to get this Constitution to go into effect. So, out of that argument, two different groups emerge. You have the Federalists. They are seen as nationalists. They are fighting for a strong central government. They view liberty as best protected by a large republic. Going back to what James Madison said on the last slide and what he talked about in Federalist 10, he felt that a large republic would bring so many factions to the table, so many different groups of people, that the contest or the conflict between those groups of people would actually protect everyone, better than a smaller republic that maybe the majority would have more control. There were strong Federalists, strong nationalists. There were also more moderate coalitions that didn't view the Constitution as it was written originally as perfect, but were still in favor of approving this new government because the Articles of Confederation simply weren't working for them. Then you have the Anti-Federalists, who really were states' rights advocates, who definitely wanted the new Constitution to be closer to that of the Articles of Confederation than it was. They preferred a confederation or a small republic. And really the breaking point for the Anti-Federalists becomes the Bill of Rights. They say, we need some safeguards to protect the people, to protect minorities. That is the Bill of Rights. We're not okaying the Constitution without it. So that becomes the sticking point. Now, there were certain liberties that were guaranteed by the Constitution before the Bill of Rights was added. Right? The Bill of Rights are the first 10 amendments, so they're not included in the original Constitution, though they come very quickly after. But there's some liberties, some freedoms that are guaranteed in the original Constitution. So, let's see here. Basically, the original Constitution says that citizens of each state are entitled to the same privileges. You have the right to a trial by jury. It calls for no ex post facto laws, which are laws that, if they were put into effect, they can't go back and charge you for violating that law before the law was put into effect. So for example, with prohibition, no ex post facto laws say if prohibition passed, we can't go back and charge everyone that's ever drank alcohol, right? Because it was legal at the time that they did it. Your writ of habeas corpus is protected, so you can't be wrongfully imprisoned. Those sorts of things are guaranteed in the original Constitution. But that wasn't enough for the Anti-Federalists. They call for a Bill of Rights, right? They need that. That becomes a sticking point. The other sticking point comes more so as a geographical sticking point between the North and the South. People from the northern states at this time, there are already people that are ready to get rid of slavery in the original Constitution. But the southern states have a lot of our population. We need them on board for ratification. So we know that outlawing slavery in the original Constitution will lose us the South, and this won't pass, right? So since they need these southern states, they need to make some compromises on slavery. Now, one of the issues comes with how are slaves going to be represented in Congress? Because if you remember, we have a popularly elected, population-based House of Representatives. So if Virginia, if half of their population are slaves, should they be counted? Because for all other purposes, they're viewed as property, not people. Virginia, of course, wanted them counted for representation because it would have given them more of a say in Congress. They didn't want them counted, though, for taxation purposes because then they would have had more tax liability for the central government. So you can't like have your cake and eat it too, right? So out of that comes the 3/5 compromise. They say for purposes of taxation and representation, every 5 slaves will be counted as 3 people. All right, so on this slide, you can see how the ratification fight really panned out by state. The Constitution goes to the states in September of 1787, and it takes until 1788 to get the 9 out of 13 states required for ratification, and the Constitution then goes into effect. But there were states where this battle was strung out for a few years even. So you can see on this chart, we have states that are strongly in favor and ratify fairly early. But you have a close struggle in a lot of the really big states, the populous states like Virginia and New York. You can see there's also a couple states that are initially opposed and eventually do ratify by the end of the battle. But the fight for ratification was not easy, and it was strung out to some level. Now, the Constitution today is sometimes referred to as a living document, right? Now, the framers, when writing the Constitution, were really vague in some areas, right? We assume that they wanted to create a government that could last for centuries. And so that document needed to be able to grow and adapt to changing circumstances. So how we interpret the Constitution today may be different in some ways than the founders really intended, right? But we're not mind readers, we're not time travelers, so how do we know exactly what their intention was? Okay? But people who say that the Constitution is a living document tend to be more expansionary in terms of the power of the federal government. That aligns more with a liberal political view or the Democratic Party in many ways, where original intentionalists really think that we should just stick to the words that are on the paper, right? Because that's what the framers intended. Those people tend to be more conservative, tend to value states' rights more than expansion of federal power, so on and so forth. This is a huge fight in how the courts interpret the Constitution, because that is largely their job. And so when we talk about like liberal and conservative Supreme Court justices, this is really what they're referring to. Additionally, I would encourage you to think a little bit about how the Constitution remains relevant 200 years later, right? In a world that today is very different than the one that it was written in, right? So, how's a 200-year-old document stay relevant? I want you to think a little bit about the pros and cons of treating the Constitution like a living document, because there are certainly pros and there are certainly cons. So take a minute to think about that. All right, that's all, folks.